Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
I got a return guest. I got Jay Anglin. Jay, welcome back to the show.
Always great to be here, buddy.
Jay is our Waterfowl 360 Great Lakes migration editor, and it just so happens that we may have a minor migration event going on. Good news for hunters throughout the Great Lakes, those whose season's still in. Jay, kind of let's get us started. What are you seeing in your area, and what are you hearing, just about even this small weather system that's pushing through the Great Lakes right now?
Well, it's kind of a broken record from most hunters. They go out and they hunt and they're not doing terribly well. And I think the biggest thing, it's a function of the weather. And, a lot of guys want to point fingers and blame whoever. But at the end of the day, when you have birds that are well fed and completely content, they really don't have to do anything. So they'll sit for days on end. A couple of things that are going to drive them out of that cycle is obviously ice and snow cover. Now, we have a total lack of snow cover for most of the area here. There is a band of snow cover in southern Wisconsin that kind of moves up into central Michigan. And interestingly, there's large concentrations of Canadas and mallards sort of in that 100-mile band. Now, the seasons are closing rapidly. A couple goose seasons kind of, continue on into early January, but there's not going to be a lot of pressure. So it's really incumbent upon snow and ice in particular. And right now, Wisconsin is freezing up for the most part, very cold temperatures at night. Northern Michigan also. So you're going to start seeing some lake effect snow cover. So that's going to drive those birds down to, Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. And, down here, our seasons are also kind of winding down in northern Indiana, certainly in Illinois. And Ohio. So we just got to get them out in front of the weather and the season so they can drive some birds south to guys down there waiting, because we've had some good hunts. But again, the weather is hard to come by. And this this system that's headed out east, this big system, it's just going to kind of nick us in Indiana, but Ohio's getting hit pretty good. And really, those are the situations where you just have to figure out a way to get out there, because that's when the birds are going to move. And that's really been the biggest thing. There's birds around. They just don't move. They don't do a whole heck of a lot,
Yeah, no, we've done, obviously with all the migration alerts that we're doing, throughout the country, it's pretty odd that we have everybody saying the same thing. There are birds in many areas, even across, some of the Mid-South areas where I hunt, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee. There are some birds, but they don't have to do anything. There's no pressure on them as far as weather goes. And that's really playing into, everybody's season. Now you kind of touched on Illinois a little bit. You did a migration alert last week, and the numbers there were pretty fantastic. Yet, we're hearing a lot of complaints like, man, the hunting's terrible. It's just so spotty. Some guys are doing really well. We had Yetter on the podcast saying that, there's tons of ducks, but he's having like his worst season ever. So, kind of elaborate on that and just what you're hearing as far as some of those Great Lakes states and some of the maybe less optimistic mentalities that you're talking to these guys.
Well, that's probably one of the greatest examples of how, really great habitat of all kinds, moist soil, marsh, open water, river bottom, et cetera, et cetera. It's well managed by the feds and the state and private, entities. And it draws millions of birds. And yet you have guys that really know their game. I mean, guys that are used to hunting big numbers of birds, so they have great decoy spreads, they're calling, they're proficient at calling, et cetera. And they can't even, there's guys hunted for a week and shoot one mallard. So, really, again, it comes down to just the weather and the caloric. They just have literally enough built up, fat reserve, and they're fat and sassy and perfectly content to just sit all day. So what I've noticed is, over there, certainly they had a lot of moist soil because we had a lot of high water early. And then, Most of the big river systems drop dramatically through the summer. We're really low around here, low in clear water. So a lot of the mud flats that were dry all summer into the fall. And so like a lot of moist soil growth, a lot of weeds, a lot of seeds that ducks prefer really. And so you're not seeing even really a lot of birds move out to feed on corn. I know we're hunting corn birds that generally go out and feed daily, twice really. They're not doing it. They might do it once or twice a week. But for the most part, they'll go find a little patch of smartweed in a little spot, and they'll just go sit in that and just pick at smartweed. They're just not hungry. Illinois did lose, according to Yetter's survey, the latest one. They lost 40 to 50% between the IRV and the Mississippi River Valley. And since, the one where they were just staggering numbers, and the numbers are still really impressive, which really speaks to that's just such an amazing area. And again, guys still aren't doing well at all in terms of, their season ends, I think today, in the North Zone. So for ducks, so, a lot of those guys are struggling, and it is what it is.
I don't think there's anybody out there who, is really looking at this and like, oh man, this has just been great. Like you said, it's, these people are struggling out there. And a lot of that has to do with just we talk about the weather, but really all it is a lack of weather. Now, I know you don't really cover this region, but we're sitting here watching, this snowstorm. Like you said, it's going to clip a little bit of Indiana, some of Ohio, but it's really going to impact Pennsylvania and then all the way over into the Northeast. That's the kind of weather system that we need to start there, maybe in Minnesota, and kind of push south across the Great Lakes region. The 10, 15 inches of snow, some big north winds. I mean, that's the kind of system, at least from my perspective, that we need as far as like hunting down here in the Mid-South. We need something to shake it up. And it just hasn't materialized.
Snow cover, again, is so important. We just haven't had it because the temps haven't been right. And we really haven't had much precipitation for that matter. But again, Wisconsin's really getting cold at night. And I always look at Wisconsin because Wisconsin has an incredible amount of habitat. Minnesota's also freezing up. So, if they don't have snow, you're still going to have birds hold out and dry feed. And they're certainly doing that according to the reports I was looking at this morning in the central part of the state, Canadas and mallards, your late season classics up here. But those birds are going to start running out of water, and they're going to get tired of hanging out on a river, and they're going to start moving down. And, hopefully we get some ice up here that sticks around, but I'm looking at the long range, and it's really kind of not too exciting. I mean, we get a little warmer next week. I don't see any snow cover building up and certainly staying. So it's just, it's sort of this perpetual cycle we're in this year, and it's frustrating for everybody. And, there's nothing holding, I constantly hear people talk about, the flooded corn. Look, the guys that own hundreds of acres of flooded corn up here managed specifically to shoot ducks. They're not shooting any ducks. So they're fairly nocturnal. They use it as a loaf, and during the day, they're just not doing anything even in those spots. So it is what it is.
Yeah, I kind of keep my ear to the ground for weather systems and watch weather all, especially up north of us. And like you said, it's going to warm up again for you guys next week. And I've had this question all the time. Hey man, where are the ducks? What's going on? Where should I be looking? This and that. And I'm like, man, it's 45 degrees in South Dakota. Our long-term forecast that I'm looking at has December 21st in South Dakota. It's supposed to be 46 degrees. That doesn't really bode well as far as pushing birds out. But I'm also looking at on Christmas Day in South Dakota, it's supposed to be 12 degrees with a 25 mile an hour north wind. That could be a game changer. And so we're really, scratching and clawing and really trying to find that silver lining, that one big push that's going to get birds at least down to us and even parts of southern Illinois. I know my buddies there in southern Indiana, they've really struggled. They're hunting bottomland habitats. It's dry. It's, there's not a ton of birds around. They don't have to do anything. Some of them even kind of put the boat away. What are you hearing from parts of southern Indiana and even some southern Illinois? That very tip of southern Illinois holds a bunch of birds. You hearing anything down there?
The same that you're hearing generally. Some guys that are, lucky and just get into a situation where you find a little patch of birds and take advantage of them, there's definitely been a push of birds out of that Illinois sweet spot down into like Western Tennessee and Kentucky and, maybe Southeast Missouri even. So birds are getting very close, to the southern part of the flyway. And you talk about out east, the bottom line is that's going to push birds too. I mean, we're talking about a substantial amount of snow cover. So those birds are going to funnel down pretty quick too. But, back over here in Indiana, the one thing I could tell you is the guys that focus on divers have had a pretty darn good season. I mean, there's days when they're not going to move a whole lot, but, they just kind of forget about mallards and say, I'm going hunting, I'm going to have fun. And there's plenty of divers of all species, really, all over, up here, down there. I mean, guys are shooting a few scoters in southern Indiana. Those are sea ducks. When people think of those, they think of like big, rugged, waves and heavy surf like you would on Lake Michigan in a storm. And there they are down on some, small reservoir in southern Indiana or Kentucky. It's kind of crazy. So there's diver hunting, and that's a silver lining in my opinion. And then again, the goose hunting, we've got tons of geese. There's geese migrating. I saw geese migrating Sunday, high birds. The biggest thing is just getting them to move. So really you're just looking for that day that's cloudy, maybe some rain, a little precipitation, a little wind. And you have to capitalize on a year like this. You definitely have to capitalize on those days.
Yeah, what are you seeing as far as white fronts? Are you seeing them any up there in northern Indiana?
We had a fair number of them over the last month. Up until last week, it was commonplace to hear somebody say, "Hey, I saw some specks," and some of the Fish and Wildlife areas were holding a few. I know I saw, I don't know, probably a couple thousand in my general area over the course of a couple weeks. And some of those are obviously the same birds buzzing around. You know how they are. But I think we've lost a few of those, and I don't know. Talking to Randy Smith in Illinois, they have an inordinate number of specks, up in the north zone right now, in the central zone of Illinois, or that was as of a week ago. Some of these specks, if I had to guess, have moved north a little bit even, but who knows? I mean, they're really a peculiar bird. I know you're very familiar with them down there. We're just kind of learning the ropes on them, and here one day, gone the next, and then back the next. And they're noisy enough that you would hear them. So I just think they just go for a ride. It's crazy.
Oh no, you're right.
Yeah, they have to, right? They go for a ride, man.
Yeah, I was sitting out in my driveway on Saturday evening, and it was probably 7:00, dark, and I probably hadn't heard specks over my house in Memphis since late October, maybe early November. And we're sitting there, and I'm like, "Did you hear that?" And of course, my wife looks at me like I'm crazy, and sure enough, I had two different flocks of specks come over the house, moving north to south. And all that is just a shift in the wind. We picked up a north wind last weekend, and there they go. So, maybe some of those birds that were stuck up there in Illinois, decided to ride that wind for a little bit. But again, those birds could be moving back north at any time, big south wind, and they're going for another ride.
We have a huge number of sandhill cranes where I live here. I mean, massive, concentrations. We're talking tens of thousands of them up and down the Kankakee River watershed. And what I've noticed is, the specks have, it just seems like where they're really focused, where they're really concentrating, you're not seeing a lot of ducks, nor are you seeing a lot of Canada geese. Now, you might see Canada geese 5 miles away, but they don't like to commingle. But specks, for whatever reason, they dig the sandhills. So wherever you find sandhills up here now, you will find some specks. And I've seen them actually as recent as last week. I saw a flock of specks and a flock of sandhills actually flying to the roost together in formation, which is really fascinating. I mean, they obviously feed on the same stuff. They graze and they're upland when they're upland feeding, and they seem to roost together, which is really interesting. It's really changed things up here. I mean, I know there's some talk. I've talked to some of the DNR guys, and we feel that there really is. These sandhills are so dense that they're having an impact on other species. And again, the exception is the white fronts seem to really hang out with them and enjoy being around them. It's really fascinating actually to watch.
And I think that's also a pretty good indicator that you guys have not gotten the really, really cold weather that you have in years past. If those sandhills are still hanging around in, northern Indiana, southern Michigan area right there, I mean, that's not that that's terribly odd, but, you would think by this time of year the weather would have pushed those birds south.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree. And what I've noticed is that the sandhills are, there's a certain component of each year. It seems like they just move like they should down, stay in the warmer climate, get out of here when the snow hits. And then every year there's an increasing number that are hanging further north. They're kind of adapting to it. And, I've seen them up here when we're in the mid-teens up here, 13, 14, 15 degrees, flying out to feed. And of course, there's very few at that time, but every year there's more and more. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing specks up here later. I really do. I think that they have some sort of they commingle, they enjoy each other's presence, and maybe it's just random, but I don't think it is. I think they're actually looking for each other. And I mean, that sounds crazy, but it sure seems like that's what they're doing, the specks and the sandhills.
That's an interesting observation. And, I think as we move further in, that northern Indiana season is probably not getting ready to close, but you're getting down to the last couple weeks, are you not?
The regular split closed Sunday, and then we open again on the 26th, and that runs through the first week of January, second or third. So we have this one little late split. The central zone and the south, or the south zone, and the Ohio River zones, of course, are still steaming along. And then our goose season runs into early February, so we still have something to go after. But Michigan's south zone, they have a late split 2-day duck goose season that is the 26th and 27th. And traditionally, that really does a good job of bouncing some birds out of southern Michigan, because everybody goes and gets their last licks in, before it's over. And it just seems like a lot of birds really start to stack up. Those late season mallards, especially mallards and black ducks, they stack up. And, by that time, generally the birds are pretty well, limited to a certain amount of water here and there. So they get pressured and they move down through Indiana pretty quick. And sometimes they make a big jump. They'll just go right over the top of us and head on down south. So those are the kind of things I'm looking for to happen. Like you mentioned, that system, the cold weather in South Dakota. There's some snow to the east. I mean, you're going to see birds, and I think this late in the game, you're going to see the real tough, northern mallards that want to hang out right on the snow line. Of course, they're never going anywhere. But a lot of birds are going to make that big jump when the winds are favorable. You're just going to wake up one day, and all of a sudden you're going to have ducks. And we just got to hope. I certainly hope for all the guys down south that occurs in the next couple of weeks. And I think you'll see more birds. It's inevitable.
That's awesome. That's the most optimistic thing I've heard a duck hunter say in the last couple of weeks. One thing that I'll always stress to people is you got to go to figure out if there's any birds. So, one way or the other, I'm going. Whether the weather materializes, and you got to take advantage of those small opportunities of just a wind, simple as a wind shift. You got to take advantage of it. So, Jay, anything else that you can think of from the Great Lakes region that our listeners should be aware of?
No, just, keep getting after it. It's one of those things. It's one of these years when it's nobody's at fault. Weather's goofy, and it's our passion. Conservation is still just as important, if not more important than it's ever been. And I just think a lot of guys just, don't lose interest. This is just part of the game, And, as a fishing guide, I have years when it's incredible, I'm a hero, and other years where it's like, why am I doing this? So you just have to stay in the game and refine your game, and don't think of it like the big, huge hunt. Think of it as I'm going to go out and shoot a bird or two if I'm lucky, and I'm going to be perfectly content. And that's the best advice I have.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today, man. It's always good to bring in some local information from up there in the region.
Well, I always enjoy being here. So everybody, have a great holiday and get out there and enjoy the outdoors.
All right, man, I'd like to thank my guest, Jay Anglin, our Waterfowl 360 Great Lakes Migration Editor, for joining us today and giving us some real insight into, what's happening on the ground there and what's needed to really shake this duck season up. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for putting the podcast together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.